Hey guys, welcome to the Lean to the Left podcast, where we focus on progressive politics and the important social issues that face us all today. Our guest today is Michael Goldstein, the bearer of both bad news and good news for those who seek peace, social justice, economic and health security, sustainability, and a caring society. The bad news? Our wealth dominated system absorbs all our efforts at change without being transformed. The good news? We have an opportunity to build a massive nonviolent movement to govern ourselves and prevent those who can't stop themselves from driving us towards ruin. Who is Michael Goldstein? Michael's the author of Return of the Light, a political fable in which the American people retake their country, and a more recent nonfiction book, Blessed Disillusionment, letting go of what cannot save us, turning to what can. He's a graduate of Princeton School of Public and International Affairs and Stanford Law School, and a retired criminal appeals lawyer, having handled death penalty and other court appointed cases. Michael most recently worked in the movement against police violence, and he challenged House Speaker Nancy Pelosi in the 2018 primary election, promising to stop the rise of fascism and bring us a caring society. Hey, Michael, thanks so much for joining us on the Lean to the Left podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Hey, now your book is called Blessed Disillusionment. Is its message one of despair or is it one of hope, Michael?
It's actually both. The subtitle, as you may have mentioned, is Letting Go of What Cannot Save Us, Turning to What Can. And the hope is, the good news is that we can create the kind of society that you talked about, that's peaceful, has economic and health securities, is sustainable and caring. But the bad news and the disillusioning part is that all the means that we've been taught that work to make our democracy respond to our needs are way too little, too late, and as you said in your intro, can be absorbed by the system without fundamentally changing. And by that I mean supporting advocacy groups and clicking on their petitions, somehow getting more people out to vote, reforming whichever corporate party a person favors in the two-party system, once more electing new and better people to high office, once more building new and stronger protest movements, that none of these are enough to keep us from our rush towards the cliff, even though they're all important, especially in a time like this. And then the hope is that if we let go of that illusion and raise our sights, raise our vision to a loftier goal, which is to build a massive movement for a new, nonviolent, but real revolution in this country, we can create that society where we govern ourselves according to the needs of the people here and elsewhere and the planet.
Okay. Now, you mentioned a minute ago the two corporate parties. You lump the Democrats in that category, corporate party as well?
Yes, sir.
Why?
Let's start with the fact that Barack Obama, whom a lot of us had a great deal of hope in, promised, took a pledge not to accept money for his campaigns from corporate lobbyists. That was well known. What wasn't well known was that he accepted contributions from the wives of corporate lobbyists, from the law partners of corporate lobbyists, from bundlers of corporate lobbyists, money contributions, and that we all know that he raised record amounts in small contributions, but the other fact that hardly anybody was privy to was that he raised record amounts in large donations. Then he created an administration, which, and here I have to refer to a list,
Mm-hmm.
uh, where it began with almost every member of his cabinet being chosen from a list proposed by a Citibank executive on behalf of a group of Wall Street bankers. They created drastic expansion of drone wars, domestic surveillance, pursuit of whistleblowers. His first year numbers of deportations were higher than Trump's. Made plea deals with the big banks for their housing crisis crimes while prosecuting no human actors. Did precious little to deal with police killings of people of color, income inequality, and declining public services. Touted the inadequate and unenforceable goals of the Paris Climate Accords as a solution. The Democrats have worked to defeat true reformers like Cori Bush, Jamal Bowman, Katie Porter. The 2020 Democratic platform promised no new oil and gas permits on public lands, and Joe Biden said, and there would be no new fracking. But in the first year of his administration, they issued 3,557 drilling permits with no restrictions on fracking. And, the list is too long,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. You make your point. You really do. You make your point. So tell me, you call for a nonviolent revolutionary movement when, as you point out in the book, the state responds to the slightest perceived threat to the existing order with violence. That was even before Donald Trump was returned to the presidency. So how can this nonviolent revolutionary movement be established? What do you envision?
I think there are a couple of really good questions implicit in the one you just asked.
Hmm.
One is how to build that movement, and the second is how can it succeed if it's nonviolent?
Yeah.
Yeah. So building the movement in the book, I propose a step-by-step process, which I'll outline here, but I want to say at the beginning that, I'm just one guy, and I think as this step-by-step process begins, other people collectively had other ideas.
Right.
But the suggestion that I've come up with so far is that those who recognize that we do need a new revolution and aren't afraid to use the R word, sometimes I gulp when I say it, can begin by talking to our friends, neighbors, coworkers, fellow congregants about that idea. Because,
Hmm.
we're talking politics and what needs to happen and how scary the future facing us is. Time those who are motivated to be more active in this piece of the work can start study slash action groups. I would think on a sort of defined time framework, like 8 weeks or something like that, of finding other people who are interested in, okay, what's going to work? And read some things like Blessed Disillusionment, but other things people have written on strategies for creating social change and seek to form as much consensus they can as what's needed in terms of strategy as well as program and tactics. If that begins to happen, I would imagine that some of those groups would be self-propagating, that this action part is study action. For some people will be going out into the local struggles that their heart calls them to be involved in or they need to be,
Hmm.
and talking about the systemic nature of why Oakland schools where I live are being privatized. But others will start new study action groups. So hopefully the move that what'll be a tiny seed will begin to sprout some roots and some leaves and branches above the soil. Again, what will emerge as we do this might be wiser and more effective than what this one person can imagine in advance. But I would think that at some point we would start, fairly early, start online forums and journals to discuss these questions and to have materials to take to other people. At some point, enough unity would be developed and a large enough core group of people in each region to have regional conferences and forums, and eventually form either a new organization or network of local groups dedicated to doing exactly this, building a nonviolent revolutionary movement. And I can say more later about how they would go about doing that, but with a lot of support and professionalism in having media for educating and organizing people as we seek to resist, whatever the latest crisis or atrocity is. It's probably enough on that for now. Should I address the nonviolent question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. We will take casualties. People will get hurt. It will be scary at times. The civil rights movement of the 1960s, which was nonviolent, prepared itself for that and took its hits and ultimately succeeded in its goals. A political scientist named Erica Chenoweth and her colleague Maria Steffens did a study of, forget the numbers, several hundred movements to overthrow autocratic regimes in the entire 20th century. And those that were nonviolent were two-thirds more likely to succeed than those that were violent. If our choices are do nothing, in which case, and I thought I'd have the figures, but I don't, hundreds of thousands of people in this country alone are dying from lack of health care. We support or we kill ourselves tens of thousands of people elsewhere every year through our foreign and military policy. The scientific organizations have pointed to ghastly numbers of deaths caused by environmental pollution. So the violence is happening right now. Our choices are to do nothing and allow that to keep happening as more climate disasters happen, the environment gets worse, fascism rises because of its answer to people's discontent caused by income inequality and our lack of providing a different vision and a different explanation of the problems. The second is to take the route of armed struggle, as so many revolutions have, and create a civil war with massive casualties and which is much less likely to succeed. And if you want, I can go into the reasons why the violent movements are less likely to succeed. And the third option is to build a massive nonviolent movement to use our power to withhold our cooperation from the existing system to hasten its collapse. And yes, take some really painful hits and hold ourselves lovingly and our enemies even while we do. But as hard as it is to say that, I think that's our only really decent option.
Wow. I was going to ask you this question. With Donald Trump now boldly and blatantly turning our government inside out so he can rule with an iron hand, what can and should Americans do to fight back? And I think you just answered the question. You're saying that we've got to have some kind of a revolution. I mean, we even may have to have some violence. Is that what you're saying?
I wish I was. I don't think we can build a movement for a successful revolution within the time frame of the Trump administration. I think we have to resist through the means other guests that you've had and will have propose,
Hmm.
like organizing. I'm going to take a training later this month on how to help people resist ICE raids in my community.
Wow.
All the ways people are organizing to resist. And, maybe there will be enough leadership within a couple of years, a tax revolt or something like that
Hmm.
could put more pressure on the administration.
Hmm.
But I think to create the consciousness in tens of millions of people that the answer is revolution, and to learn to organize ourselves well enough to bring that about. And here I'm listing actually the three prerequisites for that revolution: consciousness of the need for it, experience and the structures in organizing ourselves, and new structures of self-help, whether, community gardens, local conflict resolution programs in neighborhoods, disaster preparedness programs that people create in their own localities, and mutual self-help groups. so that when the system does collapse, we are prepared to take care of ourselves. So I'm drifting a little bit away from the nub of your question. But what I'm saying is, I think that's probably a longer term project than what it takes to resist this guy and the people surrounding and backing him.
Yeah, I
But
understand. Yeah. Okay.
but if I can just add one thing, I do think it's important that we involve ourselves in those movements to resist. And there we can find people to begin to spread the message about building a movement beyond Donald Trump so that we don't just go back to the betrayals, as I see them, of the Clinton and Obama and Biden administrations that feed more of the discontent that fascism itself feeds on.
Wow. That's not a bright outlook. We have going on now something that's just never happened before that I can recall. And I've been covering politics for many decades. And I've never seen anything like having this billionaire Elon Musk, in effect, being, I don't know, vice president. He's even more than vice president. Trump has put him in a position where he's able to dictate what is going to happen in this country with respect to all manner of things. Like, for example, the Consumer Protection Bureau that they've announced they're going to cancel, USAID, which has been a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy for years, 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 years and years. Incredible what's going on. What are your thoughts about these dangers and what, if anything, can be done to slow it down or stop it?
So, at the level of the kinds of programs you just named as examples, I'm not sure that we can build enough grassroots protest to successfully resist.
Mhm.
People don't see foreign aid as affecting them or the whichever consumer protection bureau is being dismantled, affecting their day-to-day lives. However, long before Trump, academicians on the left were talking about a deep state. There is a massive bureaucracy that I believe, among other things, has set up and formed through legislative action to meet the needs of an advanced corporate capitalist system that realizes that certain things are necessary to serve the people in order to avoid levels of discontent that are could threaten their system and its stability and possibly lead to its dismantling. So I think that with at least some of this crazier stuff, both within the bureaucracy and within some of his corporate backers and in Congress, including the Republican Party, is crazy and as proto-fascist as many of them are. And I think there are going to be forces that try to put on the brakes. That's just my point of view. And they'll do a lot of damage. Also, in the other realm that we alluded to earlier, the more authoritarian stuff that affects people directly, like the deportations.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Now, in my view, Trump's breaking the law in front of the entire country, just as we progressive Democrats have been predicting he would.
Right.
Not a single elected Republican has had the courage to try to even speak out against his lawlessness, but only a few Democrats have also done that. So, you talked earlier about the Democrats being complicit in all of this, going back to the Obama administration and some of the misdirections that occurred under President Obama. But what should Democrats do now? What should the Democratic Party be doing now, in your opinion, to turn all of this around, if it's even possible, given the fact that they have no seat of power in the House of Representatives or the Senate or the White House or the judiciary?
My book came out towards the end of the first Trump administration.
Hmm.
And in part of my critique of the Democrats at that time, what I pointed out was that they did boldly denounce many of Trump's policies, which they're good at doing, at least until this moment when they're out of power. But what they didn't do, and in my view, for institutional structural reasons, can't do,
Mhm.
is mobilize the population itself or do what emergencies require, conduct sit-ins on the House and Senate floor,
Right.
do what they can to block action through parliamentary or disruptive means. I was almost going to say, I don't want to try to answer this question because I don't see them doing whatever it is we think they should do.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
to me, it goes beyond mistakes in messaging or timidity. If mobilizing the population, which would be the most effective thing, is dangerous because if
Right.
we learn to mobilize ourselves, we might go a little too far.
So you really are calling for a revolution. Revolution. That's what you're calling for, right?
I am, and I'm not saying that's the only thing we can be doing or need to
Yeah.
be doing, but I am saying, and this is why it can be seen as a message that contains, despair in it, or at least disillusionment. I don't think anything else will save us.
Uh-huh. Tell me a little bit about your book, your newest book, and how that addresses all of this stuff.
Well, it came out of an essay that I had published in the Huffington Post in 2013 called All Is Not Lost, 12 Theses on the Way Forward. And one of those one thesis held that if we fail to build a movement towards revolutionary change, we're actually going to be feeding the rise of fascism because of worldwide economic developments, technology allowing jobs to be shipped overseas, and other factors leading to the end of enough post-war prosperity that could be shared with working people here to keep people happy without repression. And that so I'm saying one piece that's in a book, the book is a broader analysis of the factors that give rise to fascism,
Mhm.
which are discontent and the need to direct people's attention to internal and external enemies and place their hopes in an authoritarian strongman ruler and stuff like that. And it looked like that was coming in 2013 if we didn't start moving towards providing a better explanation of what's wrong and how to fix it. So the book explores quite a bit of that, those dynamics in more depth than we can here.
Sure.
And and in the first half of the book, I think part one is called The Bad News, and it does explore each of the means of trying to bring about change that we've taught can work for us and their limits. And the second half is the good news, which suggests a pretty detailed map forward about how to get started building the kind of movement that the book talks about, and including going into some of the questions that have to be answered in order to unite into some sort of formation that supports itself and its members in promoting the idea of revolution, the organizing that we need, and the building of alternative structures. For example, it imagines a founding convention of a new party or a new organizational network and explains that in order to function, we need to develop unity on program with what political parties call a platform, what it is we're struggling for.
Mhm.
Unity on program, unity on strategy, and unity on tactics, and goes into some depth on what program is, what strategy is, what tactics are. So, and then there's a whole appendix with suggestions on how to form and operate a study action group to get started, things like that.
Okay, that's cool. All right. Well, I hope you guys pick up this book. It sounds like it's one that we all need to check out. Now, I don't know if this is a fair question for you or not, Michael, but it seems to me that Trump is trying to put incompetent sycophants in cabinet and sub-cabinet positions of power in order to give him free rein to impose his will, his move towards his version of a dictatorship. Do you agree with that assessment?
I do. And I also think it's a mistake on his part. I
Uh,
think those people will be less able than more insiders, if you will, who know how to work with those bureaucracies and
right.
get the gigantic ship of state moving in different directions. But I think that's what he's trying to do with those incompetents.
Yeah, well, you know
And
what? It seems to me that to to get the troublesome federal agencies out of the way, he's just canceling them. I mean, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, that's the consumer bureau that I was mentioning before. Musk has called for the deletion of this bureau, of this agency. And Trump fired his director. And now I think the Treasury Secretary is Scott Bessent is the acting director. So that's what he's doing, right? I mean, do you see that?
yeah, and again, I'm sure you know far more about it than I do. I do think that even with a lot of Trump appointees in the judiciary, that sooner or later the courts will stop a lot of this stuff. You know, he doesn't have the power to delete it. Agencies set up by Congress,
Yeah.
operating with funds that Congress directed be spent for those purposes.
Yeah. In the meantime, he's putting a whole hell of a lot of people out of work in all kind of probably personal and financial trouble and just in order to do what he wants to do, I guess.
So that's the other thing. I do think it's going to produce blowback.
Yeah. Well, we already see in some court cases, and some judges have said, no, you can't do that. Now, what I don't understand, and I don't know if it's fair to ask you this or not, but what these executive orders, are they really able to be left in place? We have Congress and legislation, and our system of government was set up to have a system of checks and balances. And he's just saying, screw that. I'm not doing that. And he's saying, I'm just going to order this and I'm going to order that. And we're going to get rid of this and we're going to get rid of that. So what you're saying is there's going to be court challenges of all of that. And that's not going to stand up. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm saying that, and when I said blowback, I
Yeah.
meant when you named people, real people who are getting affected, whose
Yeah.
livelihood and survival are being threatened.
Right.
Maybe they'll pressure their unions to take broader actions of resistance that could help. What if they screw up the postal service further in a couple of years? How's the public going to respond to that?
Hmm.
Um, but I also think, going back to the illegality of what he's doing with these executive orders,
Yeah.
I suspect that he's smart enough to recognize that some of those victories will only be temporary, that even some of the people he's fired will, through civil service protections, get their jobs back.
Mhm.
And that then he can blame the socialist courts
Yeah.
and the deep state for screwing with the policies that the American people want.
The socialist courts, he's appointed most of the judges and he stacked the Supreme Court, right? With
Yeah,
yeah. I
yeah.
mean, oh
And
man.
now that you're mentioning that, there's a factoid I have to throw in about what we can expect from Democrats, who of course are not proto-fascist and definitely, in my view, the lesser evil.
Hmm.
The Wall Street Journal last week or the week before headlined a story about Trump having appointed, I think, 353 federal judges during his term, that Biden appointed 356, and that the analysis was that the Biden appointees added more demographic diversity to the federal judiciary, to the bench, but did not move it anywhere ideologically, that it was centrist appointments, that it didn't help in any way undo what Trump had done.
Right.
Um, so, yeah, the judiciary is not going to be uniformly reliable to enforce the law. On the other hand, my experience with the judicial system myself, and from what I've learned secondhand and watching, oftentimes not all the Republican appointees or ex-prosecutors are right-wing ideologues. And, a lot of them follow the law a lot of the time.
A lot of the time.
I'm not saying we're living in a situation where things are good.
Yeah. No, you're not. You know what? I was really fascinated. You have this background where you were an attorney and you were representing people on death row, other defendants where you were appointed to be their counsel. How did you move from that career to what you're doing now?
Well, some of it was happening at the same.
And he's a really good writer, but if you can say something in 10 words, he'll find a way to say it in 25. So I guess maybe that's what you're talking
I
about,
don't know
right?
if it's our training or if it's genetic, but
Uh,
so what I want to say and answer your question about how I moved from the
oh yeah,
criminal
yeah, yeah.
practice to this is I decided to go to law school at the end of the 60s when there were a number of so-called people's lawyers out there like Charles Gary and William Kunstler who were to the left at that
Uh-huh.
time.
Uh-huh.
They work defending anti-war activists and Black Panthers and bringing civil lawsuits that helped bring about consumer protections and civil rights protections and stuff like that, broadening the First Amendment rights.
Mhm.
And so I thought I want to be one of those. By the time I left law school, I'd been exposed to enough radicals on the campus that I was on in the anti-war movement that was still very strong at that point
Right.
to recognize that, in my opinion, they were right, that the issues were systemic, that I had learned that the war wasn't just mistaken policy, but undertaken for imperialistic reasons.
Right.
In a seminar at Princeton where we read everything that the National Liberation Front wrote about its goals. But by the time I left law school, I realized change comes from the activism. And if the activism and the popular movements are strong enough, then legislatures respond, the executive responds, even the courts respond. So practicing law and a related gig I had for 12 years working for a legal publisher were kind of a B job. They were a way to
Okay.
support my new family
Okay.
and use the skills that I had.
Okay.
Now, in the criminal appellate work, I found myself fighting for justice, and we almost always lost, even in the so-called liberal judiciary of California.
Right.
On criminal cases, judges would rubber stamp affirmed no matter what happened at trial.
Mhm.
But there was reward in giving my clients who were behind bars or facing in the future execution dates the knowledge that somebody was really in their corner, which I was.
Right.
So I continued that as long as I could and as long as I had to make a living. But I'm 77 now, so I was finally able I was eventually doing that part time while I was writing Huffington Post blogs
Okay.
and books and that sort of thing. And
Okay.
now I'm semi-retired and trying to be an author.
I got you. There you go. Okay. Well, that's a great thing, and I really appreciate what you're doing. I think it's just wonderful, and we need more people who are willing to stand up and put themselves out there and say, "Hey, we need to fix this. Our country's in trouble, and I think it's in serious trouble right now, worse than it's been in a long time." And all of these things that Donald Trump is trying to do, very, very dangerous, I think, for the future of this country. So I hope that you and others that are taking up this fight stick to it because we sure do need to find a way out of this mess,
I
my
totally
opinion.
agree with you. And
Yeah.
as I said before we started recording, I really appreciate all the work you're doing on the level on which you see it as important to direct your energy because that's invaluable too, especially in with the crisis of the short run.
Oh, I thank you very much for that. All right, guys, I really do appreciate you coming on, Michael. And your books are available on Amazon. I know that because I've come up with some links that I've put in the description of this episode. So, people, if you're interested in his books, either to purchase them or just to find out more about them, just click on those links that I've put in the description for you, and it'll take you right to them, and you can do that. So, Michael, thanks so much for being with us. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Only my thanks to you for inviting me. And I might regret this, but no, I'll do it a safer way. I was going to give my email in case people had questions for me directly,
Yeah.
but there's a little bit safer one. Go
Okay.
to the website, the99percentsolution.org.
Okay.
And 99 is digits, percent is spelled out. The
Okay.
99percentsolution.org. That's to be a website where those of us who want to do the kind of work I'm talking about can find each other.
Okay.
Right now, there's nothing but a contact form, but use that and you can send me an email.
Okay, great. That's great to know, and I will add that to the description as well. So, Michael, thanks so much for being with us, and best wishes to you and all that you do.